On a bright spring morning in a bustling suburban neighborhood of Minneapolis, Officer Reynolds sat in his patrol car, sipping his third coffee of the day. The seasoned police officer had been on the force for 15 years, and his colleagues knew him for his quick temper and questionable behavior during traffic stops. What happened next would not only change his life but would spark a conversation that would ripple through the entire community. Mrs. Anderson, a respected high school chemistry teacher with 20 years of experience, was driving to school in her silver Honda Civic. She had prepared an exciting experiment for her students that day and was looking forward to seeing their faces light up with curiosity. Her morning routine was the same as always, dropping off her daughter at basketball practice before heading to work. As she turned onto Oak Street, she noticed the patrol car parked near the intersection. Without warning, the police lights started flashing behind her. Confused but remaining calm, she pulled over to the side of the road, her hands visible on the steering wheel just as her father had taught her years ago. Officer Reynolds approached her vehicle with his hand resting on his holster, an unnecessary gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the three bystanders who had stopped to witness the scene. Mrs. Anderson rolled down her window, maintaining her composure despite the officer's aggressive stance. "License and registration," Officer Reynolds barked, not bothering with the customary greeting or explanation for the stop. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" Mrs. Anderson inquired politely, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She had done nothing wrong, her registration was current, she hadn't been speeding, and all her lights were working perfectly. "I said, license and registration." The officer's voice grew louder, his face reddening with unexplained anger. Mrs. Anderson reached slowly for her purse, narrating her movements clearly. "I'm reaching for my purse to get my license, officer." She had learned this protocol from her husband, who worked as a civil rights attorney. As she handed over her documents, she noticed more people gathering across the street, some with their phones out, recording the interaction. What happened next would be viewed millions of times on social media. Officer Reynolds began berating Mrs. Anderson, claiming she had run a stop sign that didn't even exist at that intersection. When she calmly pointed this out, his demeanor became even more hostile. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded, his voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. Mrs. Anderson, knowing her rights but also understanding the volatility of the situation, pressed the record button on her dashboard camera, a birthday gift from her security-conscious brother. She then complied with the officer's demand, stepping out with deliberate slowness. The growing crowd of onlookers watched in horror as Officer Reynolds roughly grabbed Mrs. Anderson's arm, attempting to force her into a submissive position against her car. But Mrs. Anderson, despite her fear, remained remarkably composed. In a clear, unwavering voice that would later be praised for its dignity under pressure, she spoke, "Officer, I am a high school teacher, and my students are waiting for me. I have complied with all your requests, and I am recording this interaction. I would like to speak with your supervisor." Her words seemed to pierce through the officer's aggressive facade. The mention of recording and a supervisor made him hesitate, his grip on her arm loosening slightly. Unknown to him, one of the bystanders was a local news reporter on her morning jog, live-streaming the entire incident to her news channel's social media platform. Mrs. Anderson continued, her voice gaining strength, "I understand you're doing your job, officer, but there is no stop sign at this intersection. I've driven this route to school every day for the past 12 years. If you check the traffic laws for this street, you'll find I'm correct." The gathering crowd had grown to include several of Mrs. Anderson's former students, who began calling out in support of their beloved teacher. Their presence added another layer of witnesses to the unfolding scene. Just then, a second patrol car pulled up. Officer Reynolds's supervisor, Lieutenant Rivera, stepped out, having been alerted by dispatch about multiple calls from concerned citizens. The lieutenant quickly assessed the situation, noting the crowd of witnesses, the multiple recording devices, and most importantly, Mrs. Anderson's calm demeanor in contrast to Officer Reynolds's aggressive stance. Lieutenant Rivera's arrival marked a turning point in the confrontation. He immediately ordered Officer Reynolds to step back and release Mrs. Anderson. The lieutenant had received numerous complaints about Reynolds's behavior in the past, but never had there been such clear evidence of misconduct. Mrs. Anderson, still maintaining her composure, provided a clear, articulate account of the events to Lieutenant Rivera. Her words were measured and precise, her demeanor professional, the same skills she used daily in her classroom now serving her in this crucial moment. The incident would later become a catalyst for change in the department's training procedures and community relations. But at that moment, standing on that suburban street with her arm finally free from Officer Reynolds's grip, Mrs. Anderson was simply a teacher who refused to let injustice pass unchallenged. As the lieutenant apologized and assured her that the matter would be thoroughly investigated, Mrs. Anderson checked her watch. She was now late for her first class. Yet somehow, she knew that today's most important lesson wouldn't be taught in her chemistry lab, it was unfolding right here on Oak Street, witnessed by dozens of community members who would never forget what they saw that morning. The story was far from over, but its first chapter had already begun to reshape conversations about law enforcement accountability in their community. And it all started with one teacher's dignified response to an unjust situation. News of the incident spread through the community like wildfire. By lunchtime, cell phone footage from multiple angles had been shared across social media platforms, and local news stations were running the story on repeat. Mrs. Anderson's chemistry classroom became an unexpected sanctuary as students and fellow teachers stopped by to offer their support. The school principal, Dr. Williams, had already seen the videos and immediately offered Mrs. Anderson the day off. But she declined, saying, "Our students need to see how to handle difficult situations with dignity. Running away won't teach them that." Her decision to continue teaching that day would later be cited as an example of exceptional character by the school board. During her free period, Mrs. Anderson sat in her classroom, hands slightly shaking as she finally allowed herself to process the morning's events. Her phone buzzed continuously with messages of support from parents, former students, and community members. One message, in particular, caught her attention. It was from a civil rights organization offering to help her tell her story. Meanwhile, at the police station, Lieutenant Rivera was reviewing Officer Reynolds's body cam footage alongside the numerous videos submitted by witnesses. The contrast between Mrs. Anderson's composed responses and the officer's aggressive behavior was striking. The lieutenant had dealt with problem officers before, but this incident was different. It had caught the public's attention in an unprecedented way. Officer Reynolds sat in the break room, his face ashen as he watched the incident trending on local news. His colleagues walked past him, some avoiding eye contact while others shot disapproving glances. He had always justified his actions as maintaining authority, but watching himself on video, he struggled to recognize the person he had become. By afternoon, the story had caught the attention of national media outlets. Mrs. Anderson's phone rang during her last period class. It was a producer from a major news network requesting an interview. Her students watched as she politely declined, saying she needed time to consider the best way to address this situation. After school, Mrs. Anderson found her husband waiting in the parking lot. A civil rights attorney himself, he had spent the day fielding calls from colleagues offering to take the case. But Mrs. Anderson had different ideas about how to handle the situation. "This isn't just about me," she told him. "It's about creating real change in our community." That evening, as Mrs. Anderson sat with her family at their kitchen table, her teenage daughter asked a question that would shape the direction of events to come. "Mom, what if Officer Reynolds had done this to someone who couldn't stand up for themselves?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Mrs. Anderson thought about her students, their families, and all the people in their community who might not have the resources or knowledge to handle such situations. She realized that her response to this incident needed to be about more than just personal justice. At the same time, across town, Lieutenant Rivera was meeting with the police chief and city officials. The incident had exposed deep-rooted issues within the department that could no longer be ignored. The chief, a veteran officer with 30 years of service, recognized that this could either tear the community apart or become an opportunity for meaningful reform. Social media continued to buzz with activity. #ChemistryTeacherStrong started trending locally, with former students sharing stories of how Mrs. Anderson had impacted their lives. One post from a former student, now a medical student, went viral. "Mrs. Anderson taught me more than chemistry. She showed me how to stand up for what's right while keeping your dignity intact." The local teachers' union called an emergency meeting to discuss the incident. They had dealt with cases of discrimination before, but never with such clear evidence and public attention. The union president, watching the various videos for the 10th time that day, realized they had an opportunity to push for broader changes in how law enforcement interacted with their community. As night fell, Mrs. Anderson sat in her home office, drafting a statement with her husband. They had received countless offers for interviews and legal representation, but she wanted to approach this thoughtfully. "This isn't about revenge," she explained to her family. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Her daughter, working on homework nearby, looked up and said, "Mom, my friends say you should sue." Mrs. Anderson smiled gently and replied, "Sometimes, making real change requires more than just legal action. It requires understanding, education, and community involvement." The incident had sparked numerous conversations throughout the city. In coffee shops, at dinner tables, and in online forums, people debated not just this specific case, but broader issues of power, responsibility, and justice. Mrs. Anderson's measured response had given people a framework for discussing these sensitive topics without resorting to anger or hatred. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds sat alone in his home, reading through the flood of social media comments. For the first time in his career, he was forced to confront the impact of his actions not just on one person, but on an entire community. The weight of public scrutiny was crushing, but perhaps necessary for the revelation he was beginning to have. As Tuesday drew to a close, Mrs. Anderson finished grading papers, maintaining her normal routine despite the extraordinary circumstances. She had received word that the police department would be making an official statement the next day. Whatever happened next would set the tone for how their community dealt with similar incidents in the future. Before going to bed, she checked her email one last time and found a message that would open up unexpected possibilities for turning this incident into an opportunity for positive change. The sender's name was familiar, a respected community mediator who had worked wonders in other cities facing similar challenges. The stage was set for what would become a watershed moment in their community's history. But first, Mrs. Anderson needed to decide how to use her unexpected platform to create lasting change while staying true to her principles as an educator and community member. Wednesday morning arrived with a sense of anticipation hanging over the city. Mrs. Anderson woke up early, preparing for another day of teaching, but this time with a clear plan forming in her mind. The community mediator's email had offered an intriguing possibility: organizing a town hall meeting where citizens and law enforcement could engage in honest dialogue. As she drove to school, she noticed how different the streets looked today. Neighbors waved in support, and passing cars honked in recognition. The local coffee shop had put up a sign reading, "Standing with our teachers." Even the crossing guard gave her a thumbs up, a small gesture that brought tears to her eyes. At the police department, Officer Reynolds arrived for his mandatory administrative leave meeting. The walk through the station felt like a walk of shame. His fellow officers, once friendly faces, now turned away or gave him disapproving looks. The weight of his actions was finally sinking in, especially after spending a sleepless night watching more videos of his past interactions that had surfaced online. Lieutenant Rivera sat across from Reynolds in the conference room, a thick file of civilian complaints spread between them. "This isn't just about yesterday," the lieutenant began, his voice firm but not unkind. This is about a pattern of behavior that we can no longer ignore." Reynolds stared at his hands, the defensive anger that had fueled him for years finally giving way to something else: shame. Meanwhile, Mrs. Anderson's first-period chemistry class was different that day. Her students, usually focused on chemical equations and lab safety, wanted to discuss what had happened. Instead of dismissing their concerns, she turned it into a teachable moment about civic responsibility and peaceful resistance. "You see," she explained, drawing a parallel to their current unit, "just like in chemistry, every action has a reaction. But we get to choose what that reaction will be. We can either add fuel to the fire or find a way to create something positive from it." During lunch, Mrs. Anderson met with the community mediator who had emailed her. The mediator, a wise woman with decades of experience in conflict resolution, shared stories of other communities that had turned similar incidents into opportunities for growth. Together, they began drafting a proposal for a series of community dialogue sessions. The police chief held a press conference that afternoon. Standing before a forest of microphones, he announced several immediate changes: mandatory de-escalation training for all officers, a review of traffic stop procedures, and the formation of a civilian oversight committee. But what caught everyone's attention was his direct acknowledgement of the department's failings. What happened to Mrs. Anderson was not just one officer's mistake, he stated firmly. It was a failure of our system, and we must do better. His words, broadcast live across local stations, marked a departure from the usual defensive stance taken by law enforcement in similar situations. Back in her classroom, Mrs. Anderson received an unexpected visitor, the mother of one of her former students. The woman, holding back tears, shared how her own encounter with law enforcement had left her too afraid to speak up. "Watching you stand your ground with such grace," she said, "gave me hope that things can change." The story took another turn when Officer Reynolds's personnel file was leaked online. It revealed a history of similar incidents, many involving minority citizens, but none had gained the attention this one had. The public reaction was swift and fierce, with calls for not just his termination but a complete overhaul of the department's hiring and monitoring practices. However, Mrs. Anderson surprised everyone with her response to the leak. In a thoughtfully worded social media post, she wrote, "Exposing past mistakes should not be about punishment, but about learning and growth. Let's focus on creating systems that prevent these incidents, rather than simply condemning individuals." Her message resonated with both sides of the increasingly heated debate. Community activists praised her wisdom, while police officers appreciated her balanced approach. The local newspaper's editorial board called her a voice of reason in troubled times. That evening, Mrs. Anderson met with her family to discuss the upcoming town hall meeting. Her daughter, inspired by recent events, had started a student organization focused on civil rights and community engagement. "Mom," she said proudly, "your story is helping people find their voice." Lieutenant Rivera, working late at his desk, reviewed the proposed changes to department policies. He couldn't help but think about how many similar incidents had gone unnoticed over the years. The lieutenant picked up his phone and made a call he'd been considering all day, to a police chief in a neighboring city who had successfully implemented similar reforms. As Wednesday drew to a close, the story had evolved beyond a simple narrative of police misconduct. It had become a catalyst for community-wide self-examination. Local businesses began offering their spaces for community dialogue sessions. Religious leaders called for unity while demanding accountability. Even the city council announced a special session to discuss police reform measures. Mrs. Anderson sat in her home office, preparing for the next day's chemistry lessons while also reviewing the town hall meeting proposal. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from a national education organization asking her to speak at their upcoming conference about turning classroom principles into real-world advocacy. The incident that had started on a quiet suburban street was transforming into something larger than anyone had anticipated. It was becoming a model for how communities could address systemic issues while maintaining dignity and focus on positive change. As she finally prepared for bed, Mrs. Anderson thought about Officer Reynolds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she remained committed to her belief that education, whether in a chemistry classroom or a community meeting, was the key to lasting change. Thursday brought unexpected developments that would reshape the narrative. The town was buzzing with anticipation of the evening's town hall meeting, but first, a surprising letter arrived at Mrs. Anderson's school. It was from Officer Reynolds, hand-delivered and marked personal. Mrs. Anderson sat in her empty classroom during her planning period, carefully opening the envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper, unsure of what to expect. The letter began with two simple words, "I'm sorry." As she read further, it became clear this wasn't a formulaic apology crafted by lawyers. Reynolds wrote about his childhood in a police family, about the pressure to be tough, and about the moment he watched himself on video and didn't recognize the person he'd become. He didn't make excuses but instead acknowledged the pain and fear he'd caused countless others before her. Meanwhile, across town, local business owners were taking action. The owner of the downtown cafe had started a Community Conversations initiative, offering free coffee to groups of citizens and police officers who came in to talk together. The simple idea was already bearing fruit, with officers and residents engaging in honest dialogues over steaming cups of coffee. At the police station, Lieutenant Rivera was meeting with the newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee. The group included teachers, social workers, religious leaders, and former law enforcement officers. Their task was daunting but crucial, rebuilding trust between the police and the community they served. Mrs. Anderson's response to Officer Reynolds's letter would prove pivotal. During her lunch break, she crafted a reply that would later be cited in police training manuals across the country. "Your acknowledgement of the problem is the first step toward healing," she wrote. "But words must be followed by actions. I invite you to be part of the solution." The afternoon brought another surprise when local high school students organized a peaceful demonstration they called Stand Together. Unlike previous protests, this one included the children of both police officers and civilians, all wearing T-shirts that read, "Our community, our future." Mrs. Anderson's daughter participated in the demonstration, holding a sign that read, "Listen first, judge later." Local news cameras captured the moment when several police officers joined the students, removing their caps in a gesture of respect. The image would become symbolic of the community's efforts to bridge divides. As evening approached, the community center filled beyond capacity for the town hall meeting. People stood along the walls and spilled out into the parking lot, where organizers had hastily set up speakers so everyone could hear. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. The meeting began with Mrs. Anderson sharing her story, not just of the incident, but of her 20 years teaching in the community. She spoke about watching her students grow up to become police officers, doctors, mechanics, and parents themselves. "We're not here to point fingers," she said, "but to join hands." Then came the moment no one expected. Officer Reynolds stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent. His voice shaking, he began to speak about his own journey of realization. He talked about the culture of policing that had shaped him, the fears that had driven him, and his commitment to change. "I've spent years seeing threats instead of people," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Mrs. Anderson showed me what real strength looks like, not in force or fear, but in dignity and truth." The mediator skillfully guided the discussion that followed. Community members shared their experiences, both positive and negative, with law enforcement. Police officers spoke about their challenges and fears. The conversation was difficult, emotional, and deeply necessary. One particularly moving moment came when a young patrol officer stood up. "I became a cop to help people," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Somewhere along the way, some of us forgot that. But watching Mrs. Anderson handle this situation has reminded me why I chose this path. As the meeting progressed, concrete solutions emerged. The police chief announced new training programs, developed in consultation with community leaders. Local schools would implement programs bringing officers and students together in non-enforcement situations. A civilian review board would be established with real power to investigate complaints. Mrs. Anderson's chemistry background proved unexpectedly valuable as she explained her vision for change. Like any chemical reaction, transformation requires the right conditions. We need heat, the energy of our conviction. We need pressure, the urgency of our situation. But most importantly, we need the right catalysts, people willing to step forward and facilitate change. The meeting ran well over its scheduled time, but no one seemed to mind. People who had entered as strangers were exchanging phone numbers, making plans for follow-up discussions, and forming connections that would prove vital in the months to come. As the crowd finally began to disperse, Mrs. Anderson found herself face to face with Officer Reynolds. The room grew quiet, watching their interaction. Without words, she extended her hand. He took it, and in that handshake, the community saw the possibility of genuine reconciliation. Later that night, as Mrs. Anderson drove home, she passed the spot where the incident had occurred just days ago. The intersection had been transformed, with community members having planted flowers and placed signs promoting unity and understanding. Her phone buzzed with a text from the mediator, "This is just the beginning." Mrs. Anderson smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges but also new opportunities for growth. The chemistry teacher in her couldn't help but think about how catalysts work, not by forcing change, but by creating the conditions where change becomes possible. The day ended with hope, not just for their community but as an example for others facing similar challenges. The story was far from over, but its direction had shifted from confrontation to collaboration, from anger to understanding, from division to unity. Friday dawned with a sense of cautious optimism in the air. The local newspaper's front page featured a powerful photo from the town hall meeting, Mrs. Anderson and Officer Reynolds shaking hands, surrounded by community members with expressions of hope and determination on their faces. At the school, something unexpected was happening. Students from Mrs. Anderson's chemistry class had taken the initiative to create what they called Bridge Builders, a student organization dedicated to improving relationships between young people and law enforcement. The idea had come from a quiet student who rarely spoke up in class but had been deeply moved by recent events. Mrs. Anderson arrived at school to find her classroom decorated with handmade posters promoting unity and understanding. One poster particularly caught her eye. It showed a chemical reaction diagram, but instead of molecules, it depicted police officers and civilians coming together to form something new. The creativity and thoughtfulness of her students brought tears to her eyes. Meanwhile, at the police station, significant changes were already taking place. Lieutenant Rivera had implemented an immediate revision of traffic stop protocols. Officers were now required to clearly state the reason for stops at the outset and wear body cameras that couldn't be manually deactivated. More importantly, a new system of peer intervention was being put in place. Officers were not only allowed but required to step in if they witnessed a colleague acting inappropriately. Officer Reynolds, still on administrative leave, had spent the morning meeting with a counselor specializing in law enforcement trauma. For the first time in his career, he began to understand how years of unprocessed stress and inherited biases had shaped his behavior. The counselor helped him see that acknowledging his mistakes wasn't a sign of weakness but a step toward becoming a better officer in person. By midday, news outlets from across the country were contacting Mrs. Anderson. Her approach to the situation had struck a chord with people tired of seeing these incidents end in further division. Rather than choosing sides, she had created a space for genuine dialogue and transformation. During her lunch break, Mrs. Anderson received an unexpected visit from the superintendent of schools. The district wanted to develop a new curriculum incorporating civic engagement and conflict resolution skills. Your handling of this situation, the superintendent explained, has shown us that these lessons are just as important as traditional academic subjects. The afternoon brought another surprising development. Local business leaders had formed a coalition to fund community policing initiatives. Their first project would be creating neighborhood centers where officers could interact with residents in non-enforcement situations. The owner of a local tech company had even offered to develop an app facilitating transparent communication between police and citizens. At the police academy across town, instructors were already incorporating Mrs. Anderson's case into their training materials. But they weren't just focusing on what Officer Reynolds had done wrong, they were analyzing Mrs. Anderson's response as an example of how civilians could assert their rights while maintaining dignity and safety. The impact rippled beyond just police training. Local schools began requesting workshops on civic rights and responsibilities. Religious organizations offered their spaces for community dialogue sessions. Even the city's annual festival committee announced plans to include activities promoting police-community relationships. Mrs. Anderson's daughter had become an unexpected leader among her peers. During afternoon announcements, she spoke about the Bridge Builders program, encouraging students to see beyond stereotypes and headlines. Change, she said, echoing her mother's words, starts with understanding. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Anderson received word that Officer Reynolds had enrolled in a voluntary program focusing on bias awareness and community relations. The program, usually sparsely attended, was now filled to capacity with officers from several neighboring departments. As Friday's classes ended, Mrs. Anderson found her chemistry lab filled with students who weren't even in her class. They wanted to know how they could get involved in the changes happening in their community. One student asked a question that perfectly captured the moment. "Mrs. Anderson, how do we keep this momentum going after the cameras leave?" Her answer would become another teachable moment. Real change, she explained, is like a chemical reaction that creates a stable compound. It doesn't happen in an instant, and it requires constant attention to the conditions that make it possible. Most importantly, it needs people committed to maintaining those conditions. The day's final hours brought news that would ensure the story's impact would extend far beyond their community. A National Police Chiefs Association had requested Mrs. Anderson's input on developing new guidelines for community engagement. They didn't just want to study what had gone wrong in her case, they wanted to understand what had gone right in the aftermath. As she packed up her materials for the weekend, Mrs. Anderson reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. The incident that could have torn the community apart had instead become a catalyst for positive change. But she knew the real work was just beginning. Her phone buzzed with a message from the community mediator. Next week's follow-up session has 3 times as many people registered as yesterday's meeting. Attached was a photo of the sign-up sheet, showing an equal mix of law enforcement officers and community members. Driving home, Mrs. Anderson passed several police cars. Instead of feeling tension, she noticed officers waving to pedestrians, and pedestrians waving back. Small changes, perhaps, but significant ones. The chemistry teacher in her knew that the most important reactions often started with the smallest molecules. The weekend lay ahead, bringing with it more meetings, more planning sessions, and more opportunities for growth. But for now, Mrs. Anderson felt something she hadn't expected to feel when the week began: hope. Not just hope for her community, but hope for communities everywhere facing similar challenges. The weekend brought unexpected developments that would cement the lasting impact of what had begun as a routine traffic stop. Saturday morning started with Mrs. Anderson discovering her story had inspired action far beyond their local community. Her inbox was filled with messages from teachers, police officers, and community leaders across the country, all asking how they could implement similar changes in their own cities. At the local coffee shop, a group of officers had organized an informal "Coffee with Cops" session. The turnout surprised everyone. Citizens lined up out the door, not to confront, but to connect. One elderly resident shared stories of how the neighborhood had changed over decades, while a young mother expressed her hopes for her children's future interactions with law enforcement. Officer Reynolds spent his Saturday morning at a community center, where he had volunteered to speak to a youth group. His hands trembled as he faced the room of teenagers, but he knew this was part of his journey toward redemption. "I'm here," he began, "to show you both what not to do and how to make things right when you've made a mistake." Meanwhile, Mrs. Anderson's daughter had organized a student documentary project. Teams of high school students were interviewing community members, police officers, and local leaders about their experiences and hopes for the future. The raw honesty of these conversations would later become a powerful teaching tool in police academies nationwide. By afternoon, the local park had transformed into an impromptu community gathering. Families brought picnic baskets, children played basketball with off-duty officers, and conversations flowed freely between people who might never have interacted before. Mrs. Anderson watched from a bench, grading papers while occasionally joining different groups to listen and share. The police chief made an appearance at the park, not in his official capacity but as a community member. He pushed his granddaughter on the swings while chatting with concerned parents about their hopes and fears. "This is what community policing should look like," he remarked to Mrs. Anderson. "Not just responding to problems, but preventing them through relationships." Later that day, Lieutenant Rivera called Mrs. Anderson with surprising news. Police departments from 3 neighboring cities had reached out, wanting to implement similar changes in their communities. "Your handling of this situation," he explained, "has given us a blueprint for turning crisis into opportunity." As evening approached, Mrs. Anderson attended a small gathering at her local church. Religious leaders from various faiths had come together to discuss their role in maintaining the momentum for positive change. "Healing requires faith," one pastor said, "not just in divine intervention, but in our ability to grow and change together." The day's most powerful moment came when a young patrol officer approached Mrs. Anderson at the church meeting. "I almost quit the force this week," she confided. "But watching how you handled this situation made me realize we need officers who care about making things better, not just officers who know how to make arrests." Sunday brought more developments. The local newspaper published a special section featuring stories of positive police-community interactions that had gone unreported over the years. These stories provided a counterbalance to the negative incidents, showing that change was possible because it was already happening in small ways. Mrs. Anderson spent Sunday morning preparing for the week ahead. Her chemistry lessons would now include discussions about how scientific principles like action and reaction applied to social change. She believed that helping students see these connections would make both their scientific and civic education more meaningful. The police department announced new hiring criteria that emphasized community relations skills alongside traditional law enforcement capabilities. Psychological evaluations would now include assessments of candidates' ability to handle stress without resorting to aggression. The changes were small but significant steps toward preventing future incidents. By Sunday afternoon, Mrs. Anderson's story had caught the attention of state legislators. A committee was being formed to review police training standards statewide, and they wanted her input. She agreed to participate, seeing it as an opportunity to create systemic change while keeping the focus on practical, community-level solutions. Officer Reynolds, still processing his role in sparking these changes, spent Sunday writing in a journal, something suggested by his counselor. His entries revealed a man grappling with his past actions while trying to find a way forward. "Maybe," he wrote, "my biggest contribution to law enforcement will be showing others what needs to change." The community mediator organized a Sunday evening planning session for the next town hall meeting. The agenda was ambitious, moving beyond dialogue to create concrete action plans for sustaining the positive changes that had begun. Mrs. Anderson suggested breaking large goals into smaller, achievable steps, just as she did with complex chemistry concepts. As the weekend drew to a close, Mrs. Anderson received a call from a national education organization. They wanted her to develop a curriculum that would help teachers address civil rights and community relations in their classrooms. It was an opportunity to extend the impact of recent events far beyond their local community. Looking ahead to Monday, Mrs. Anderson felt both exhausted and energized. The past week had been intense, but the changes she saw happening around her confirmed her belief in the power of education and dialogue to transform communities. Her final task of the weekend was reviewing her lesson plans. Tomorrow's chemistry class would study catalysts, a topic that now carried new meaning for both teacher and students. She added a note to discuss how, like chemical catalysts, individuals could spark changes that affected entire communities. As night fell, Mrs. Anderson sat on her porch, reflecting on how a moment of confrontation had evolved into a movement for positive change. Her phone buzzed with one last message, a reminder for tomorrow's Bridge Builders meeting. The students had chosen their first project, creating a video series about positive police-community interactions. The weekend was ending, but the real work was just beginning. Mrs. Anderson knew that maintaining momentum would be crucial in the weeks and months ahead. But looking at all that had been accomplished in just a few days, she felt confident that their community had found its catalyst for lasting change. Monday arrived with a sense of purpose that permeated the entire community. At the morning's first staff meeting, the school principal announced the formation of a district-wide task force on community relations. Mrs. Anderson had been nominated to lead it, alongside a diverse group of educators, parents, and student representatives. The day's first surprise came during morning announcements. The Student Council president shared news of a citywide youth summit planned for the following month. The focus would be on building bridges between young people and law enforcement, with workshops led by both students and police officers. The idea had grown from a casual conversation in Mrs. Anderson's classroom. In her first period chemistry class, Mrs. Anderson noticed something different. Students who normally sat quietly in the back were now actively participating, drawing parallels between chemical reactions and social change. One student's observation particularly struck her. Just like a catalyst lowers the activation energy in a reaction, understanding each other lowers the barriers between people. Across town, Officer Reynolds began his first day of intensive retraining. The program, specially designed with input from community leaders, focused on de-escalation techniques and cultural awareness. During a break, he found himself sharing his story with fellow officers, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. The police department had transformed in subtle but significant ways. Officers started their shifts with community briefings instead of just tactical meetings. The morning's hot spots weren't just crime statistics anymore, they included neighborhoods where positive engagement was needed. Lieutenant Rivera had made it mandatory for officers to spend at least 1 hour per shift outside their patrol cars, engaging with residents. At lunchtime, Mrs. Anderson received an unexpected visit from a former student who now worked as a civil rights attorney. "Your handling of this situation," the young lawyer said, "has given us a new model for addressing these incidents. Instead of just fighting in court, we're looking at how to prevent these situations through education and understanding." The afternoon brought news that would extend the impact of recent events. A major police training academy had requested permission to use Mrs. Anderson's case as part of their curriculum. But unlike traditional case studies that focused solely on what went wrong, this one would emphasize how communities could work together to create positive change. The Bridge Builders program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Students from other schools were asking to start their own chapters. Mrs. Anderson's daughter, working with her peers, had developed a mentorship program pairing high school students with elementary school children to discuss community relations in age-appropriate ways. Local businesses continued to play their part. The owner of a technology company had developed a community feedback app that allowed citizens to rate their interactions with law enforcement, not just negative experiences, but positive ones too. The data would help identify both problems and best practices. Mid-afternoon, Mrs. Anderson stepped into the hallway to find a group of students gathered around a laptop. They were watching body camera footage, not of confrontations, but of positive interactions between officers and citizens. The police department had begun sharing these videos as part of their transparency initiative. The city council held a special session that afternoon to discuss policy changes. Mrs. Anderson had been invited to speak, but instead, she asked her students to present their perspectives. The council members listened intently as teenagers shared their hopes and fears about law enforcement, offering practical suggestions for improvement. Officer Reynolds, finishing his first day of retraining, made a decision that would influence department culture. He volunteered to become a peer counselor, working with officers showing signs of stress or bias before incidents could occur. His personal experience had given him unique insight into the importance of early intervention. As the school day ended, Mrs. Anderson found her classroom filled again, this time with teachers from other departments wanting to incorporate community relations into their subjects. The art teacher proposed a mural project, while the history teacher suggested studying past examples of successful community police partnerships. The local news station arrived to film a segment about the changes taking place. Instead of focusing on the initial incident, they highlighted the positive developments that had followed. Mrs. Anderson watched as students confidently explained their initiatives to the reporters, their words reflecting both hope and determination. Late afternoon brought another significant development. The police chief announced the creation of a permanent community advisory board, with Mrs. Anderson invited to serve as one of its founding members. The board would have real power to review policies and recommend changes, ensuring that recent progress would continue. As evening approached, Mrs. Anderson attended a planning meeting for the upcoming youth summit. The room buzzed with energy as students, teachers, and officers worked together on the program. One student's suggestion captured the spirit of the moment: let's not just talk about what divides us, let's create something new together. The day's final hours brought a moment of quiet reflection. Mrs. Anderson sat in her classroom, looking at the posters her students had created. Each one represented a different aspect of community building: trust, communication, understanding, and growth. Together, they told the story of a community finding its way forward. Her phone buzzed with messages from other teachers across the country, asking for advice on implementing similar programs in their communities. She began drafting a response, knowing that what had started as a local incident could help create positive change far beyond their city limits. As she prepared to leave for the day, Mrs. Anderson noticed a new addition to the Bridge Builders Bulletin board, a simple quote that read, "Change isn't just about reacting to what's wrong. It's about creating what's right." She smiled, recognizing her own words from the town hall meeting, now taking on a life of their own. Monday was ending, but it felt more like a beginning. The community had moved beyond the initial shock and anger of the incident, finding purpose in creating lasting change. Mrs. Anderson knew there would be challenges ahead, but she also knew they had built something powerful: a framework for turning conflict into cooperation, fear into understanding, and problems into possibilities. 1 month had passed since the incident that transformed their community. On this particular morning, Mrs. Anderson stood before a packed auditorium at the city's first Youth and Law Enforcement Summit. The audience was a sea of diverse faces: students, officers, teachers, and community members, all gathered to celebrate their progress and plan for the future. The changes in their community had become tangible. Crime rates had decreased, not through aggressive policing, but through improved communication and trust. Traffic stops were now recorded not just on body cameras but also rated by citizens through the new community feedback app. The data showed a significant improvement in police-civilian interactions. Officer Reynolds, who had completed his retraining program, took the stage alongside Mrs. Anderson. His transformation had become a powerful testament to the possibility of change. He now led workshops for other officers about recognizing and addressing bias, sharing his personal journey from confrontation to connection. The Bridge Builders program had expanded to every school in the district. Students proudly wore their organization's pins, a simple design showing two hands clasped together. More importantly, they had created lasting connections with local law enforcement through mentorship programs and regular community events. Mrs. Anderson's chemistry classroom had become a model for integrating civic engagement with academic subjects. Teachers from across the country visited to observe how she wove lessons about community building into her scientific curriculum. Every reaction needs the right conditions, she would explain, whether in chemistry or in society. Lieutenant Rivera presented the results of the department's new initiatives. Body camera footage now served not just as a tool for accountability but as a training resource, highlighting positive interactions between officers and citizens. The department's new hiring criteria had attracted a more diverse pool of candidates who saw law enforcement as a way to serve and connect with their community. The summit featured student presentations that moved many to tears. One group shared video interviews with elderly residents who had lived through decades of community police tensions. Another team presented research on successful police reform initiatives from around the world. The depth of understanding these young people demonstrated gave hope for the future. During the lunch break, Mrs. Anderson observed something remarkable: officers and teenagers sharing meals together, engaged in animated conversations about everything from sports to career aspirations. What had once been interactions marked by tension and suspicion had transformed into genuine connections. The afternoon sessions focused on sustaining momentum. Community leaders presented plans for permanent structures to support ongoing dialogue and improvement. The local business coalition announced funding for youth programs and community policing initiatives. The city council revealed new oversight measures that would ensure transparency and accountability. Mrs. Anderson's daughter unveiled the student documentary project, which captured the community's journey over the past month. The film showed not just the challenges they had faced but the innovative solutions they had created together. It ended with a montage of hopeful messages from community members of all ages and backgrounds. The police chief's announcement drew enthusiastic applause. The department's new training program, incorporating lessons from their community's experience, would be adopted by law enforcement agencies across the state. Mrs. Anderson's case study would be required reading for every new recruit. As the summit continued, success stories emerged from unexpected places. A group of former troublemakers had become peer mediators in their schools. Officers who had once been skeptical of community policing now led neighborhood engagement programs. The changes weren't just institutional, they were deeply personal. Late afternoon brought a surprise announcement. The governor's office had taken notice of their community's transformation. A statewide initiative would be launched, using their model as a template for building better relationships between law enforcement and communities across the state. The day's most powerful moment came during the closing ceremony. Students and officers took the stage together to perform a piece they had created, a combination of spoken word, music, and personal testimonies about their changing perspectives. The performance ended with a call for continued commitment to understanding and growth. Mrs. Anderson's closing speech was brief but powerful. "A month ago, we stood at a crossroads," she said. "We could have chosen the path of division and anger. Instead, we chose to build bridges. Today, we're not just celebrating what we've accomplished, we're committing to the work that still lies ahead." The summit concluded with a candlelight ceremony in the school courtyard. As darkness fell, hundreds of lights flickered in the evening air, each representing a personal pledge to maintain the positive changes they had created. The sight of officers and citizens standing together, their faces illuminated by candlelight, captured the spirit of their transformed community. After the crowds had dispersed, Mrs. Anderson returned to her classroom. On her desk lay a letter from Officer Reynolds. "You taught me that true strength lies not in asserting power," he wrote, "but in having the courage to acknowledge our mistakes and work towards something better." Looking out her classroom window, she saw students and officers chatting casually in the parking lot, some making plans for upcoming community events, others simply sharing stories about their day. This, she realized, was the real measure of their success, not in grand ceremonies or official programs, but in these small, natural moments of connection. Her phone buzzed with a message from the community mediator. "This isn't an ending, it's a beginning." Mrs. Anderson smiled, knowing that while their story had inspired others, the real work of maintaining and building upon these changes would continue. As she gathered her things to leave, she paused by the chemistry demonstration table. The catalyst she had used in last week's experiment still sat there, reminding her of how small changes could trigger larger transformations. Their community had found its catalyst in an unexpected moment of crisis, but its reaction would continue long into the future. The sun was setting as Mrs. Anderson walked to her car, casting long shadows across the school grounds. She could see the intersection where everything had started, now transformed into a symbol of community unity. The flowers planted there had bloomed, their colors bright against the evening sky, a living reminder that from difficult moments, new growth was always possible. Their story had become more than a local incident, it was now a blueprint for communities nationwide, proving that positive change was possible when people chose understanding over division, dialogue over confrontation, and hope over fear. As Mrs. Anderson drove home, she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to strengthen the bridges they had built together.